today is Jamie Panetta, a PhD and Professor Emeritus of Cognitive Science, the group in Neurosciences and Psychiatry at UCSD. He was a co-founding member of the Cognitive Science Department, Director of Cognitive Neuroscience Laboratory, until his retirement in 2018. His research includes the neural bases of higher order cognition, specifically social cognition, the neuroetiology of autism, the role of mirror neurons in social behavior, neuron plasticity, and brain-computer interfaces. He served on several NIH committees and was the reviewer for several scholarly journals. He's the author of many articles, books, and reviews on the interconnectivity between brain and mind. In his research, Dr. Panetta uses brain imaging techniques, as well as behavioral, psychological, and pharmacological methods to understand normal and abnormal cognition. As principal investigator on long-term projects studying autism spectrum disorder, he is interested in developing strategies to reduce cognitive, behavioral, and neurofunctional deficits through self-directed neural plasticity. Dr. Panetta is scientific co-founder of Cybernetics and Otosound, biomedical companies involved in the treatment of clinical disorders. He is also an active advisor to a variety of neurotechnology companies. He will speak today on the evolution and neuroscience of human sociality. Dr. Panetta.
Thank you for that introduction. Very nice introduction. First of all, I want to thank everybody for being here, especially on a Saturday, so to hear this talk. And let me get started. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. So this talk is actually based on a book that was recently published called The Social Impulse, which is really my perspective on the evolution and neuroscience of social behavior. And I dedicated this book to three individuals who whose work and whose ideas kind of provide the framework for the argument that I'm going to be making to you. And these are Charles Darwin, Herbert Spencer, and Nicholas Tinbergen. Now, the argument that I'm going to make and sort of the big picture that I present in this book is the following: that life is a very complex dynamic between two very fundamental principles of nature. The first one being integration, and these are factors that bring things together. And the second one is differentiation, which are factors that take things apart. And so the dynamic between these two factors underlies most of nature. And my argument, or at least my perspective, is that Darwinian evolution focused primarily on one side of that equation, on the differentiation side. And this has created an incompleteness, if you will. And so Darwinian evolution has a lot of problems explaining certain things like sociality, especially human social behavior, behaviors like altruism or selflessness, right? And so in this book, then, I provide what I think is a more balanced view to account for social behavior in general and human social behavior in particular, right? So the focus of this talk is going to be much narrower than that big picture. And I broke it down into at least two parts. So in the first part, I'm going to talk about the evolutionary origins of sociality, trying to answer two questions. What is it? And why did it come about? Why did it evolve? And then in part two, I'm going to focus on the neural basis of that behavior, trying to answer, again, two questions. Where in the brain does it happen? And how? How does it happen, right? So after all that, then I'll conclude and hopefully then open it up to your questions, right? Now, if, as I go along, if there's anything unclear and you want me to clarify, please don't hesitate to raise your hand and I'll stop and try to clarify, but please hold all other questions until the end, okay? All right. So let's dive into the first part, the evolutionary origins of sociality. Okay, so most of you probably are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. And it's typically visualized as a triangle with about 5 levels. And the idea is that at the very bottom are the most basic human needs, the physiological needs, the need for food, for water, for air, and that kind of thing. And Maslow's argument is that as you satisfy primarily or satisfy most of these needs, then you move on to the next set of needs, which would be like safety needs, and so on until the very top, the very peak of human needs, which he called self-actualization. And here we're talking about personal growth, self-fulfillment, peak experiences, those kinds of things. But note that in between the top and the bottom, there are these, what people have called social needs, the need for love, the need for belonging, the need for esteem, right? And so my argument in the book, which is consistent with Maslow's view, is that social needs are as fundamental as physiological and safety needs. And the argument I make is that that's because they reflect an impulse, a drive, a very innate drive that we have for integration, right? And so in trying to define then, what am I talking about? What is the social impulse? It's specifically that. It's an expression, it's probably the most complex expression in my mind of this integration principle, the idea of wanting to bring things together. And so I define it as the drive and the degree to which individuals in a population come together in groups and form alliances, cooperative alliances and societies and so forth. And the dynamics of that produces a set of behaviors, social strategies, if you will, that then maximize fitness and survivability for those groups, right? So the social impulse is the drive to come together, and out of that come strategies to maximize survival. If you look at the evolution, though, of this drive, of the social drive, it has actually taken many different paths. And so think of it as a spectrum of strategies that evolve. And on the one end of the spectrum are the solutions that insects like the bees, the ants, and wasps sort of came to. These are social organisms, social animals, but in order to achieve sociality, they developed extreme levels of specialization. That's the way they achieved it. And so, for example, in bees, in a hive of about, I think a hive has about 20 to 80,000 bees, there's only one female who lays the eggs, right? That's high level of specialization. There are only a few hundred males who have sex with the queen, and that's all they do, nothing else. They don't work, they don't do it, just have sex with the queen. And then the rest are worker bees, mainly females, who then subspecialize into things like guarding the nest or caring for the queen, producing honey, etc. Right? So again, the idea is to develop what's called eusociality, which in eu means in Greek, I think, is good. In order to produce this good social group, they develop these extreme levels of specialization, right? So that's one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum are non-human primates, and especially humans, who have very flexible roles in terms of what they do. They like the bees, we take care of the young, we defend our territory, we cooperate, but we also do other things which has been labeled pro-social behavior or pro-sociality, as distinct from eusociality. And that has to do with things like informing, comforting, sharing, helping others. And especially when you help others, it could be at the expense to oneself. And this is where the idea of altruism and selflessness comes about. Humans and maybe higher primates can sometimes express that kind of behavior, right? Sacrifice themselves for the need of others. And so the idea is that we base our society on these kinds of cooperative behaviors to achieve common goals. Now, one of the things that always comes up in my talks is the question of, well, if humans are pro-social and we're at that end of the scale, why is it that we tend to be so antisocial sometimes, right? As if there's a dark side. Is there a dark side to pro-sociality? And this is what this cartoon by Calvin and Hobbes is indicating. So here's Calvin. He's answering the phone and he says, hello? No, my dad's not here right now. Will I take a message? I don't know. What's in it for me? And then after he hangs up, he says, people always think you're some kind of altruist, right? So again, this notion that there's some dark side to pro-sociality. So what I want to remind everybody is that what I'm talking about here are actually strategies that evolve. And it doesn't preclude the idea that there are strategies that under certain circumstances we would think of as being antisocial or more competitive kinds of strategies, more selfish behavior, threat sensitive and aggressive actions like bullying, threatening, intimidating, even to the extent of maybe even killing our competitors, right? So we are capable of doing both under certain circumstances or when it's needed, right? Competitive and cooperative strategies. Okay, I'm focusing mainly on the cooperative strategies. So again, back to this idea of the spectrum of strategies. What's interesting is that the field has kind of divided up into what the field of social neuroscience, which is the one that studies what is more in common with other animals, what humans have more in common with other animals. So, for example, all vertebrates, which includes amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, we all exhibit motivational systems of aggression. We have these systems of aggression. We exhibit sexual parental play behaviors. And in general, these are systems that are controlled both by the brain, by neural activity, and by hormonal systems. But they tend to involve very little of what we would call cognition or mentalizing or cognitive processing, right? And so that's the field of social neuroscience. Another field has specialized more on the higher order social strategies, which are more highly flexible and require more of this mentalizing. So social cognitive neuroscience is that field that looks at those unique behaviors. Right? So just to give you a sense of where the field is at. Like I said, we share pro-social behaviors with our cousins, non-human primates, especially the chimps and the great apes and those animals. Again, I'm talking about what we share is this pro-social behavior, that it's flexible and that involves this mentalizing, right? Now, as I'll come to in a bit, to be able to do all that requires a big brain, and I'll come to that. But what I want to discuss now is the idea that it's been very difficult actually to demonstrate pro-social behavior in non-human primates. And if you look at the literature, if you go into the studies, some show it, some don't show it. And so the controversy is, do they really have it? Do they not have it? And my sense is that there are barriers to studying cooperative behavior in the lab. And two major ones are the fact that we don't have a common language. And so it's very difficult to ask them, right? What are you thinking? What are the strategies that you're using to solve these problems? We don't have that. But the second one is that we now know that a lab environment in which these animals are caged and, under very unnatural conditions makes the animal less cooperative, more selfish, and more competitive, right? So it's hard to extract the cooperative behavior out of them. And what has happened in the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years is a focus more on what are called naturalistic studies, studies in the wild or in more naturalistic environments. So I want to describe this study, this recent one by Van Leeuwen in 2021. And what they did here is they taught chimps to press a button. And when they pressed the button, a water faucet turned on, but the faucet was pretty far away so that the individual pressing the button couldn't take advantage of drinking the water. And so you see here, there's a female chimp pressing the button with her right foot along with a little tiny chimp. And then you see on the other side where the faucet is, someone else taking advantage of the water, right? And so the question they asked was, once they know how to press the button, will they press the button more when there's either no one at the faucet or when there's somebody who will take advantage of that near the faucet, right? In other words, do they exhibit selfless behavior? Will they press the button even though someone else will benefit from that? And so these are the results. There's probably a lot of stuff here, but I'll take you through it. So they studied 3 groups, group 1, so you can see my group 1, 2, and 4. And on the left side, the data for how the frequency of pushing, how often did they push that button? And then on the right side is the frequency, I'm sorry, for how long they pressed, right? So how frequent and for how long. And what you see is that compared to the control condition where there was no one by the faucet, as opposed to the test condition when there was somebody near the faucet, all the groups tended to do more. They pressed more and for longer duration. And what's interesting is if you look at group 4 here, the differences were pretty dramatic. And the way they describe it is that group 4 was a larger group and they already tended to be more social. And therefore they seem to exhibit more of this kind of selfless action, right? So the results show that in fact our cousins can exhibit pro-social behavior. Now, what about humans? What is it like in a human to exhibit pro-social behavior? And so I want to take you through this wonderful cartoon here. So you see at the very top here, a male sitting at a desk, a female comes over and says, lunch, and he says, okay, and off they go. They start sharing lunch, they start eating without saying very much. After a while, the female says, you don't talk much, do you? And he says, yeah, no, it's not my thing. And why do you think so? And he ponders that for a little bit and then he comes back. I wrote a paper about it once. I'll email you a link to it. This is a beautiful example of a modern social interaction in humans, right? Something that could happen with any of us. And so we could spend the whole rest of the talk just analyzing it, but I simply want to look at that first frame. Lunch? Okay. Think about all the conventions, the social training, the cultural training, the self-monitoring that has to go on for the male to say, okay. In other words, he's got to think, is it lunchtime? Am I hungry? Do I like this individual? Do I want to go share things with her? You know, and on and on and on, right? So the response to a single word, and we assume that there's a lot of this mentalizing that's going on in order to understand what she means by it and in order to respond. And so that's what I mean by mentalizing, right? In fact, here's the definition. The range of cognitive processes, I got this covered so I can't read it. The range of cognitive processes that we learn through social and cultural means, and this is what's important, they make the world meaningful through understanding signals generated by other members of the same species, and this allows us to then interact with one another, right? That's the mentalizing strategies. Well, in 1974, this American philosopher, Thomas Nagel, threw a monkey wrench into, into this idea. And he wrote a paper, a very interesting paper that he titled, "What is it like to be a bat?" Right? I highly recommend that you read it. It's a very short paper, like 1 or 2 pages. But it's basically an argument against the idea of what's called reductive materialism. That is, the idea that through science, we can understand the other, or the subjective experience of someone else. And he used a bat as an example. And his analysis is that it doesn't matter how much you know about the anatomy, the physiology, the biochemistry, the psychology of a bat, you'll never know what it's like to be a bat, right? The subjective experience of being a bat. That gets translated into this, understanding the subjective experience of your friend. You can't understand the subjective experience of someone else by simply knowing from a third person perspective all about it, right? And his argument was that we can understand if and only if there's something that it is like to be that organism or that person, right? That was his conclusion. And so the way I interpret this is the following, that there has to be a category of mental experiences that we have that provide the basis for that subjective experience and for that understanding of the other, right? Without those unique experiences, we cannot know what it's like to be the other. And so my argument is that, in fact, since 1974 and before that, scientists have begun to identify a variety of experiences that I call what is it like to be experiences, right? That we have. And these evolve, again, to maximize our ability to survive, to fit in. And it's mainly helping us understand others as conscious beings with internal mental states, right? This is what these strategies that evolve are. And again, by mentalizing, I mean the ability to reflect on one's own behavior and that of others. And specifically, so if someone is crying, how do you understand what is going on in that person, right? So understanding the mental states, emotional states of others is part of this mentalizing. But it also involves learning through observation and imitation, showing empathy and compassion, being self-aware, acting with intentionality, right? So all those are the strategies that have evolved. Now, I have, tend to categorize these strategies into at least 2 different types, right? So there are those that we sort of are born with, what I call innate strategies. And these tend to be kind of very fast. We're not aware of them sometimes, that they're unconscious, they're automatic responses, but they basically are helping us to accommodate to our environment. And the way we do that is by adopting the gestures, the mannerisms, the speech patterns, the attitudes of people that surround us, and why do we do that? In order to fit in order to be liked, in order to understand them, right? And so these kinds of innate strategies include things called motor resonance, mimicry, coordination, emulation, imitation. They're just a whole bunch of things that have been studied that seem to do this sort of help us adopt to the environment. And on the bottom right, you see 2 kids mimicking one another, right? It's something that kids do a lot. They probably don't know why they're doing it, but it's part of this sort of social responsiveness to be like the other. Now, more recently, and this is one that I am really fascinated by, is one of these kinds of innate strategies was studied by a group by Tung et al. In 2015, and it's showing the relationship between social behavior and the microbiomes, right? So most of you know the microbiome are the set of bacteria, the viruses, the fungi, and the DNA that lives on our skins, on our bodies, but also inside of us, right? And they have adapted so that they are actually helpful to us. They help us digest food. They help our immune system response and so on. And so what Tung et al. Found was, or what he suggests, is that in fact, physical interaction, social interaction, may have evolved to help species share these microbes. Because what they observed was in baboons, to these guys here, baboons that tended to groom one another more often had more similar microbiomes than those who didn't. And so when you have similar biomes, it means that you've shared, because typically when things are isolated, when individuals are isolated and they have different diets, they tend to have different kinds of bacteria and fungi. When they come together, they become more similar and they share those things, right? So again, this is one of these social behaviors that is helping us adapt and survive, which I found fascinating. Now, the second category of strategies are ones that are more, they're slower, they're more conscious, more deliberate kinds of strategies. And these include things like mirroring. Now, I'm going to come to mirroring towards the end of the talk and describe it. But it basically means the ability to understand how something is done and the goals of that action so that you can imitate it simply by observing, right? So that's an ability that humans have that's very unique. We also have empathy, which is the sense of feeling the feelings of others. Theory of mind, which is understanding that in fact others have internal mental states much like we do, right? We also have self-awareness, which is our ability to self-monitor and self-reflect. And then finally, we have this, what's called self-other distinction. We can tell the difference between myself and others as a human being, right? We can separate that. Okay, so these strategies are create this fundamental needs to be social because they are so advantageous, right? But they also provide high degrees of interconnection with others in our group. And so this kind of worldview that I'm presenting is summarized really well by this psychologist, Nick Humphrey, who argued that, in fact, we evolved big brains not so much to understand the world, but to understand each other, right? That drive to be social is what drove the brain to increase in size. So I want to turn a little bit to that idea. Is it true? Is there evidence for that? And so this is what's called the social brain hypothesis, right? And the premise is actually quite straightforward. The idea is that as primates began to gather in larger and larger groups, in greater and greater complexity, that the demands of keeping track of everybody, who is the alpha male, what's the relationship between that guy and the alpha male, social relationships became very demanding, and it's computationally very difficult to keep track of all that. And so the need for, say, larger memory, a larger brain was the outcome of that, right? And so this guy, Robin Dunbar, in 1992, made this hypothesis very explicit. And he actually studied a whole bunch of different animals non-human primates, mammals, dogs, cats, etc. And what he found was that, in fact, our neocortex, or the neocortex in these different animals, is directly proportional to the size of the social network or the social complexity in which that animal is embedded, right? And so the bottom right graph is this sort of function that shows that smaller brains tend to have very small social groups. Larger brains tend to have larger social groups, right? So the size of our brain is related to the size of that social group. Now we can kind of pinpoint more or less, when in our history this started to change. And this can be seen in these two graphs. I'll take you through them. So in the top one, what you're seeing here is the changes in the body weight in humans over the last 3 million years, right? And you can see that the changes in size, how big we got, was, there was a slight increase, right? But this is, I'm sorry, whoops. This is quite different than the changes in brain volume that occurred during the same period of time. So, right? So in the last 3 million years, you can see that the size of the volume of the brain increases, and then something happens and it just explodes, right? And the question has been, what is it that created this sort of explosion in brain size? Is this when primates began to gather in larger and larger groups? The evidence suggests that yes, that around that time, that's when more complex groups began to form. But the problem is that there are other things that also happened around the same time. And so it's difficult to separate which is the more important factor, right? So the social dynamics is the one big factor, but it doesn't exclude the idea that maybe there were some genetic changes that occurred, the emergence of novel genes to promote brain growth. There were certainly climate changes during that time that created physical challenges, like, now you got to go and find food somewhere else, you got to hunt somewhere else, you got to remember, where the new space is and so forth. So environmental changes happened. And then finally, there were also cultural changes that occurred. Believe it or not, around that time, fire and cooking sort of developed, and cooking basically made food more easily digestible. And so you didn't need to spend a lot of internal energy to digest that food. And so that energy in the digestive system was now utilized for something else, and people assumed that it went to create this higher or bigger brain, more cognitive functions. So all these things probably occurred and are responsible for that sort of growth in our brain. But again, the social dynamics are important. All right, so now I move into the second part of the talk, and that's about where in the brain, are these things happening, these strategies, and how, how does the brain do it? Now, to understand sort of modern brain studies, you need to know a little bit about what are called neural networks. So I wanted to give a very short primer on, what are neural networks, so you get a sense for what I'm talking about. So here's a picture of a brain, and you see large circles, and inside large circles are smaller circles, right? So the idea is that a neural network is the small circle, which is a group of cells in some part of the brain that's connected to other groups of cells in that area, right? And so if you look at, for example, this area here, labeled color. So there's an area of the brain that's involved in color perception. And the idea is that small groups of cells that are within that area are connected to compute color perception, right? So this is a neural network, a small neural network. Now, when you connect small neural networks with other small neural networks, so in this case, the color network is connected to the angles network, which is connected to the texture. So these are different areas that are computing. When you see texture in the world, there's actually a part of the brain that's doing that. When you see angles, a part of the brain does that. When you see complex image, part of the brain does that. And so what comes out of that is the collection of small neural networks get connected to form a larger network, which we would call the visual system, right? Out of all this, all these are part of the visual system. And even larger networks then get connected when the visual system connects to areas that are doing sensation, skin sensation, or controlling movement, or controlling sounds, right? And so you get then this global network, which we would call the sensory motor neural network, which is the activity of all these things together, which is what's happening in your brain. Even at this moment, all these things are talking to one another. Okay. So the idea then is that similarly, we have a social brain global network that comes into play because there are specific areas of the brain, specific localized areas that do self-awareness. They're responsible for that. Others that do the processing of social signals, others that do theory of mind, empathy, etc. And it's the connectivity and the function of all these small neural networks that creates this larger neural network we call the social brain, right? Keep in mind that the social brain is also talking to the sensory motor network, the global network, right? So the brain is this huge internet, if you will, of activity, but one can localize functions and speak about those in a very localized way. And so this is what I want to turn to now. Because, okay, so just to put a fine point on this, that the complex of brain areas, this social brain, that enable us to recognize others and evaluate their mental states, right? Their subjective experiences, their intentions, their desires, their beliefs, etc., comes out of these small networks connected into this larger network. Okay. So yeah, so what I want to spend some time now is just taking you through different brain areas that have been identified as playing an important role in some of these things. Okay. So one of the first things that has to occur is you have to be able to perceive and to evaluate social signals, right? At the very least, there's got to be an area of the brain that senses those things and evaluates them. And there's a lot of evidence that this area called the superior temporal sulcus plays a really important role in that. And if you look at the left brain here, in the shaded areas, that's the superior temporal sulcus. That's where it is. And we know that the superior temporal sulcus is really important for processing language, sounds, right? Because this is where our primary auditory cortex is, right? So when you hear a sound, it goes to that region to be processed and to be evaluated, right? But that area also processes non-language sounds, like the sound of the wind, the sound of water, which are not language-based. They are processed and evaluated in this part, this blue area here. Now, as you go further back in the more reddish area, here things are more about actions. This is an area that processes actions when they're purposeful or purposeless, right? And then on the right side of this brain, they break it down. And by the way, this is from a study by Isaac et al. in 2017, they found that in fact this posterior part of the superior temporal sulcus does things like processing the site of an action, of a social action, but also the sound associated with that social action. So for example, if I do this, right, that there's a sound associated with that you understand, and presumably this is because this area has activated and has helped you understand that. What is clapping, right? It's an area also important for the intention of that action. The intentionality is computed here, right? Okay. This just shows real data from Isaac et al, just showing that kind of that idea that in the left part, the left brain, you see that when this is an individual, one individual's brain using fMRI, showing that when they are looking at social interaction of two other individuals on a screen who are interacting, the STS, this whole area here lights up, right? But furthermore, they showed that in fact, different parts of that STS do different things, right? So they're involved in the social evaluation, but if it's the face, for example, that they're processing, one area lights up. If it's the hand, a different area lights up. And the blue and the red here indicate if the action is one that is helpful versus hindering, right? There are different parts that light up. And so there is subspecialization, if you will. So the STS is specialized overall for social signal processing, but different areas subspecialized depending on the value of the signal. Okay. Now, let me go back here. So once this area, the STS has done its whatever it's doing, information flows forward. Forward is to the right here. Oops, sorry. And so information flows towards the very tip of this temporal lobe area. And so here we come to what is called the temporal pole, which is that very anterior part of the temporal lobe. And this is an area that has been identified as really important for what's called social knowledge. That is, for the memory of people, for their names, their biographies. It's a kind of semantic memory, kind of like the hippocampus. And in fact, the hippocampus is really adjacent to this. It's right very near to it. And so the temporal pole is really important. It's what enables you to look at this image here and know that that's President Barack Obama, the fact that you know that he's the president, you know a little bit about his biography, et cetera. And the same with Albert Einstein and these other two here, right? So the temporal pole is where this kind of knowledge is being processed, social knowledge. And like the previous study by Isaac, what Olson and their team did is they also found that different parts of the temporal pole specialized. And so on the top, and especially if you look on the top right where the white arrow is, so this is the temporal pole here, and they were presenting images of very famous people and very familiar people to subjects. And what they see is that different areas are involved in the processing when they're looking at a famous face versus a familiar face. So the blue is the famous face, the red is the familiar, and in between there's an overlapping area, right? So again, here's an area that's highly specialized for social knowledge, but subspecializes for the value of the signals that it's processing, right? Furthermore, Why do I keep doing that? I don't know. The bottom brain shows what Olson et al. Also reported, and that is that once the temporal lobe does its thing, information that then flows to the to the frontal cortex, right? So these are fibers that they've identified from this area to the frontal cortex. And so again, remember, social information is flowing from the superior temporal sulcus into the temporal pole and then forwarded to the frontal lobes, which is our executive control function area, right? So, all right. The last area that the last function that I want to talk to you about is self-awareness, because this seems to be a very unique human behavior that very few animals actually show. And by self-awareness, I'm talking about the ability to self-monitor your internal states and to reflect on your feelings, your thoughts, your actions, right? So that ability is what we mean by self-awareness. And as far as we know, very few animals exhibit self-awareness. In fact, young children need a certain amount of time to develop self-awareness. So before they're about 2 years of age, they don't have that sense of, being able to self-monitor their internal feelings and states. And we also know that in certain neurological conditions, like an addiction or autism spectrum disorder or schizophrenia or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, there are decreases in self-awareness that occur because the areas that are engaged in doing self-awareness are affected in these disorders. And so what are those areas? So here is the temporal pole again, and it is an important node in this self-awareness network, right? So the temporal pole, as well as areas in the back of the brain, something called the temporal parietal junction. They form this network that seems to be really important. More evidence has been found for areas along the midline of the brain. So the right brain here is, you're looking at the brain along the midline, and there seem to be 2 areas critical for self-awareness. In the front here, called the medial prefrontal cortex, and in the back here called the precuneus. Again, they form this neural network that seems to be relevant for self-awareness. And that middle, midline network is also called the default mode network. Default mode network. Maybe some of you or all of you have heard of it. It seems to be really important for what's called narrative self-awareness. That is, when you're simply sitting, not doing anything, or just idling, if you will, resting, there's activity in that network. And we engage in what's called self-referential thinking, right? When you start thinking about yourself, your history, your, how things are affecting you. Another word for it could be introspection. You become introspective, or your mind starts to wander. So all these states produce increases in activity in those midline areas. And we think that that is responsible for this narrative sense of who you are, right? Okay. And on the right here, you see, this is a fMRI image showing these 2 areas engaged during self-referential thinking. Take a drink of water here. Okay. Well, so I've gone through and told you a little bit about where these substrates of these social strategies may be in the brain, a few of them. But now I want to turn to the how. how is it that these areas do mentalizing, social strategies? And to do that, I want to show you a 5-minute video, right, that talks about that. So let me play that. Whoop.
Why do people cry at movies? Why do sports fans get so excited during a game? Why do they feel anxious if their team is losing? The answer? Mirror neurons, a set of brain cells on either side of the head that might explain why people feel empathy.
What we found is the mechanism that underlies something which is absolutely fundamental to the way that we see other people in the world.
The mirror neuron was first discovered at the University of Parma in Italy. Researchers there identified a neuron that fires both when a monkey picks up a peanut and when the monkey watches someone pick up a peanut.
The same neurons, one neuron, fire both when the monkey observes something and when monkey is doing something. It's almost unbelievable.
It was surprising because this cell which was involved with motor planning for the monkey turned out to be interested in the movements of other people as well.
The brain uses the mirror neurons to mirror the movements it sees. And this happens in people too.
If you can use the years of training that you yourself have done, learning to crawl, then learning to walk, then learning to eat, this is an incredibly rich set of knowledge that you could apply to the problem of actually seeing what's going on. The mirror system is the way that you tap into, the way that you harness your own abilities and project them out into the world.
So sports fans can picture themselves playing when they watch a game. But what makes them feel the pain when their favorite player drops the ball?
So the idea was to try to figure out how the emotional system and this motor system are connected together.
To find out, Marco Iacoboni looked at the brain scans of individuals when he presented them with a series of faces. In the first round, he asked people to imitate the faces. In the second round, he asked people to simply look at the faces. As expected, he found that the mirror neurons were activated during both rounds. But in addition, he found that the happy area of the brain lit up whenever people either imitated or looked at happy faces. So he thinks the mirror neurons can send messages to the emotional system in our brain. And that's the mechanism that allows us to feel empathy with other people.
We strongly believe that's a unifying mechanism that allows people to actually connect at a very simple level.
So what happens if the mechanism is broken?
It's been known for some time that children with autism could be quite intelligent, but have a profound deficit in social interaction.
Christian likes to play, but like many kids with autism, he prefers to play alone. He has a hard time communicating and does not always understand questions.
So, Christian, can you tell me what you did in school today? Doing well. You're doing
Dr.
well?
Ramachandran and his graduate student hope to gain understanding of autism by studying the brainwaves of children like Christian.
So we're going to be reading your brainwaves with this cap.
When mirror neurons are working correctly, they fire both for doing an action and seeing the same action. So for most people, the brainwaves for doing and seeing look the same. But for Christian, the waves look different.
Their brains may indeed be different in that regard, and they may have deficits in the mirror neuron system. But we don't know this for sure yet. Additional work needs to be done using brain imaging.
What we do know is that healthy humans are very social.
Everybody's interested in this question. What makes humans unique? I think we can say humor, or the laughing biped. Language, certainly. Okay? But another thing is culture. And a lot of culture comes from imitation, watching your teachers do something.
So it sounds like the mirror neuron is a big part of what makes us human.
There would be very little point in having a mirror system if you lived on your own. There'd be a lot of point in having a digestive system if you lived on your own. There'd be a good point in having a movement system if you lived on your own. There'd be a good point in having a visual system if you lived on your own. But there'd be no point in having a mirror system. The mirror system is the most basic social brain system. It's a brain system which there's no point in having if you don't want to interact or relate to other people.
Okay, so these mirror neurons, which some people have called them monkey see, monkey do cells, are really unique again, in the sense that they don't know the difference between seeing and doing, right? And so for scientists, this is essentially what we call a mapping function. You're mapping, automatically mapping doing to seeing, or seeing to doing, right? It's just happening automatically. And by doing that, you are in essence simulating what you're seeing, right? It's as if you're doing that yourself. So you see an action in the world, it triggers the mirror neurons as if you're doing that action in your own brain. That's simulating. And therefore, by simulating that action, you then understand it, right? That's the concept, the idea. And so the functional significance of the existence of this mechanism is that through such simulation, and we have mirror neurons for actions, we also have mirror neurons for emotions, we have mirror neurons for audition, for sounds, right, that have been identified. And so the idea then is that through such a simulation, they provide the neural basis to understand what it's like to be the other, right? So you see someone crying, it triggers the crying mirror neurons in yourself, and you understand what that is, right? And as it turns out, the neural networks of the mirror neurons, which are shown on the right side of the brain here, this is from a study or a review by Iacoboni and the Preto. These areas overlap with the same areas of the social brain. Those areas in the front part, in the back part, in the superior temporal sulcus, right? So areas that do social processing are also doing mirroring at the same time. That's the implication. Right? All right. Come to the end here. And so what I want to do is just basically emphasize, what is it that makes us unique in terms of sociality? And there are these three things that are important. We seem to have these dedicated neural networks for not only the transduction, but the perception and the evaluation of social information and the storage of social knowledge, dedicated systems. As it turns out, even non-dedicated mechanisms can process social information as a function of the task, right? So, and then the third thing, which I really didn't get into at all, is that there's a very complex set of regulation and control of these mechanisms to maintain these mentalizing strategies, right? But the one thing I do want to leave you with, if there's one thing to remember, is that we do have this sort of global network of areas that we call the social brain that provides the means and the mechanisms for imbuing the world with meaning, right? This is one way, at least I'm proposing that this is one way we get to understand the world, what it means to be in the world, and so on. And individuals like Viktor Frankl have argued that the search for meaning is the central motivational force, right? It's what gives us resilience to be able to endure even the most traumatic suffering. So there's survival value associated with being able to extract meaning from the world. But at the same time, it provides us with, it has an aesthetic value because it provides us with the ability to have purpose, to show compassion and love and courage in the face of difficulty. And so it's this social brain that is something that we share with very few animals. All right, well, thank you for listening. And I put up my contact information here in case you want to contact me if you have comments or if we don't answer your questions. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Panetta. That was a wonderful talk. Let's show we can show our visually our applause. At least I think we're mostly muted at the present time. And so now we're going to have question and answer period. And the way this is going to work is you're going to be muted until you have a question, in which case you use the raise hand, which you should find, depending on the device you're using, will be on the bottom or the top or something like that. But you should see a hand. And when you click on that, that will show that you're ready to ask a question. And I will call upon you. And when I call upon you, you can unmute yourself at that point and ask your question, and then Dr. Panetta will respond. So the first question I see is Lisa, and if you'd like to ask your question.
The material presented this material is in the book that you first cited, and is it a book you wrote?
It is a book I wrote. Some of this material is in the book, not all of it. Yeah.
Okay, so could I get your book on Amazon?
Yeah, yes, it's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and from the publisher Springer. They have their
Okay. Yeah. Okay, and so some of that material that you presented is in the book.
Yes.
Like the neural net. Okay, thank you. Oh, I loved the talk. Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay. Annie Davison. You have to unmute yourself. You have to unmute yourself first.
I'm sorry, I keep getting notices and the notice won't go away. I'm very sorry. It was a very interesting talk. Thank you very much. I have 2-3 questions, but they are very, very brief answers. In what spectrum does Rick Hansen's work fall here, if you are familiar with him? He's a neuropsychologist.
I know a little bit about Rick Hansen's work. But not too much. So I haven't really read a lot of his things. I attended a workshop that he gave on mindfulness, and I thought that was very interesting. I have his book, and I'm trying to remember the title of the book.
He's got a lot, Neurodharma.
Neurodharma.
I've done a few of his workshops, neuroplasticity and changing the brain by rethinking. So I guess it's adjacent to what you have given us a talk on today. Right.
I would say so. I would say so. There are overlaps between.
Okay.
Because of what I'm saying.
Thank you. The other question I have was about the size of brain related to the size of the group. And I think it was Robin Dunbar's work that you were quoting. Now, what about elephants with huge brains and whales with larger brains than mine? And yet they're not that socially, they're very small groups. How does that work?
Yeah, it gets a little complicated because the argument is that a lot of the brain is necessary to maintain the physicalness of the body, right? And what we're talking about is that area that's left over. And it's primarily in the neocortex that you compare, and it's in elephants. They still have a large brain, but the ratio of that area to the rest of the brain is what's important.
I see. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk.
Yeah, thank you.
Dorothy.
I unmute myself. I am. Well, thank you again for a very great talk. I'm thinking we anthropomorphize animals, and it seems to me like pets, somehow, some of them at least have some feeling of what we're thinking. So what do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, I have a dog, and I think the dog shows a lot of emotion when he sees me for the first time, right? I come home from being outdoors and whatever, and you get a sense that they are reacting in a thoughtful, cognitive way. But it's been difficult to demonstrate that scientifically, right? So I would say that they may exhibit lower levels of mentalizing, but not quite the complicated, sophisticated levels that humans do. That would be my answer. Yeah.
Thank you.
Let me ask a question myself, since I don't see any of the hands up at the moment. Give people time to think about more questions. So I guess this relates to the Dunbar work that you showed as well. It seems to me there's a little bit of a chicken and egg issue associated with that ratio that we're talking about and the size of the group, because it could just as well work the other way, that the size of the group gets larger for other reasons, such as hunting and this and that, and whatever it turns out to be, and that requires the success, the development of a larger brain. So the causality is the question, and the causality can go either way, and one can argue a whole bunch of other things. Well, that's one question, and the related one is, one of the things that I think I've read and I've also thought myself is that the increase in the size of the brain probably may well have continued as a consequence of warfare between equally intelligent groups, which would of course require one group to attain a larger size brain in order to prevail over the other group. And that would work well with the antisocial nature of human behavior.
Yeah. No, those are good points. And like I think I mentioned, it's difficult to determine causality, and that it's only the social dynamics that led to those changes, because there were so many other things happening, right? And there are other things happening when you start hunting and exploring larger territories, et cetera, et cetera. Let me mention one really interesting recent study that tried to test this hypothesis in a different kind of way. So think about Facebook and the social networks that people form in Facebook. So there are people that have a few hundred friends, if you will, part of their network. And then there are people who have 10,000 friends as part of their network, right? There's a range. And so some scientists decided to examine the brain of individuals who had smaller Facebook networks, social networks, compared to those that had larger social networks. And interestingly, they found that those with the larger social networks tended to have larger areas in certain parts of the brain, right? Now, the question is this a causal effect, or is it, were they just simply that way to begin with? It's difficult to know, but there is a correlation, right? And one of the areas that they particularly large in people with large social groups is the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is an area that's involved in emotional processing, affect, and and that kind of thing. So it was really interesting to see that was an area that seemed to have.
Interesting, very interesting. Thank you. Julia?
Unmute myself there. Fascinating. Thank you. That was a really interesting presentation. I understand the difference between causation and correlation. I'm really getting ahead of your research, but as a clinical psychologist, I'm fascinated by the implications for treatment with autism spectrum disorder and mirror neurons. And is anyone investigating whether or not there is any, well, I guess it's too early, but getting the autistic child to mirror actions and somehow connect that with an understanding of actions of the other person, or do you see the doing versus seeing?
No, it's a.
As a therapeutic tool. Yeah.
No, and it's something that we were actually, we were very interested in that, and we pursued some studies where we, so if you look at the brains of autistic children, these areas that I'm talking about have less connectivity in regions, and actually more connectivity in other regions compared to a normal brain.
Right.
And the question was, well, if those that are underconnected, if you can increase the connectivity there and reduce the connectivity in those that are overconnected, by doing those two things, would you then bring it back to normal?
Well, and especially because usage in itself will add proteins to the connectivity. So, you know, even.
Yes. So let me just mention what we did where we looked at the underconnected areas, and through a behavioral sort of training program, we thought we could address that. We looked at fMRI before and after that training, and we found that in fact there were increases in the connectivity, and that was correlated with increases in performance in those kids.
Wow. Wow.
So that's actually been published. So we have some data, and there are folks who are actually doing that now as well.
That's really exciting. Thank you.
Sure.
Yes. I guess I'm going to get this name wrong. Soren W.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you very much, Jamie. I thought I'd just give this an opportunity. Well, first of all, a really great talk. I thought I'd just use this opportunity to say hello from late night Norway. Right. So we're following you also from Norway. And well, I can add something about the Dunbar thesis. I'm not sure so much stands or falls with that thesis for the rest of your work, as far as I could see. And I agree with what was indicated earlier, that there might be too many factors here. I mean, just to add another potential factor, it could also be that, you know, if you have a complicated social network, that you need a smaller brain, because you can offload a lot onto culture instead of carrying it around in your head. So I mean, there's a lot of possible causal effects here, and there can be many directions at once, so to speak. So it's a bit hard to say, and you have the dolphins, you know, with maybe a smaller social network, but the huge brains, you know, and then you have the ants, which have a really big crowd of friends. So it's complicated. So, but I don't think that maybe you need to be committed to these things. The rest of the talk I thought was really fascinating, and you go into so much detail on specific parts of the brain, and that's really fascinating.
Thank you.
No, thank you for those comments, and thank you for joining us from Norway. Yes, no, I agree. The social brain hypothesis is complicated, to say the least, because there are so many factors, right? And but one factor is this idea. You know, you mentioned the dolphin brain, but in fact, it turns out that the dolphin brain, even though it's large, most of it is for thermal regulation, right? At least, you know, my understanding. And so, you know,
yeah, we don't really know what the glia does either, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So there are a lot of complicating factors for sure. Yeah.
Annie?
I was wondering if there have been any studies done with children, even as young as 5, 6 years old, when they are in preschool. Some of them tend to have many friends, and others are loners. Is that reflective of anything that's happening in the brain? I don't mean the child is on a spectrum of any sort, but It just seems like there will be the popular child and then the quiet child.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about the children's studies, but it's certainly possible. But there are other factors like cultural training and so on that could play a role, in how a child behaves with others. So I don't know a lot about brain studies that have looked at children.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah.
Christina?
Hi, Dr. Pineda. It was good to hear your lecture, and it took me back to university times being at your lecture. So that was nice. And what caught my attention most was the slide about the default mode network, something I remember learning from your lectures, and how there was a decreased activity in individuals' brains with ADHD, addiction, and autism. I was wondering if you can talk more about how that manifests in people's behaviors and people who have ADHD and autism and addiction, and similarities in the way they perceive things or act in a social setting, for example.
Yeah, so we studied autistic children quite a bit, and one of the main sort of dysfunctions, if you will, is their inability to be able to put themselves in the shoes of someone else, right? Even as simple as they're sitting across from you at a table, and you ask them something like, do this. Now I'm waving with my right hand. They're sitting across. What do you think they do? They wave with their left hand, right? And part of what's been determined is that we, on the other hand, are able to make this spatial switch, if you will. We're able to put ourselves in your shoes and understand that you're waving with the right hand, and therefore we wave with the right hand, even though it seems easier to wave with the, and so this ability to take the perspective of the other is something that seems to be missing in a lot of children, especially or even in the higher functioning ones, which is the group that we study, right? So simple things like that, being unable to imitate. So if you ask them, for example, make this or imitate what I'm doing, right? That's the instruction. And you go something like this. Okay. And you do that several times. And now you ask them, okay, imitate that. What they do is they do this. They go, right? Because what they're seeing is your hand coming towards them, right? Instead of going out. And again, it's the same idea that they're not able to put themselves in the shoes of that individual, gain that perspective, and perform that action. Yeah.
And how about ADHD brains? So I feel like that's a bit more difficult to tell that someone has ADHD, for example, because they're able to mask those symptoms more. And I know that I've heard that autism and ADHD are oftentimes, they're sometimes comorbid. So I was curious about maybe, do you know how they are similar in that aspect?
No, I don't really know too much about ADHD in terms of, I know that there's a lot of comorbidity with autism. And, but in terms of how the reduction in self-awareness, for example, manifests in the ADHD, I really don't know a lot about that.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Dorothy?
Well, this may be a little bit off track, but if I remember right, people who have difficulties with proprioception, that is, feeling of their body and the physiology of the body, also have difficulty feeling emotion. And so I was wondering how this ties into empathy and the social network.
Yeah. So the way I, understand it is that emotions are embodied in your physical nature, if you will, right?
Yeah.
And individuals who have a problem embodying that activity in their physicalness have problems with expressing those kinds of feelings and emotions. So there's something basic about an emotion. There's a physical aspect of it, that needs to be present in order to be fully expressed. That's my sense of it.
So, okay, so people who cry, for example, when they see something sad, there's some. I'm just wondering. We can talk about it later.
Well, so there are individuals who cry easily and those who don't cry very easily, right? And the question is, what makes the difference? And it could be a number of things, but one thing that has been found is that people who are very empathic tend to have larger or greater activity in the mirror neuron systems than people who are less empathic, right? So there's greater activity in that. So yeah.
I guess.
While I have the
More?
floor,
Okay, go ahead, Dorothy.
I would just like to announce that this talk is being recorded, and in the chat, I have put the link to the SDIS YouTube site. You will probably have to scroll through other lectures to get to this one. And if you put your email in the chat box, I will send you the link just to this specific site, to this specific talk. But that won't be up until tomorrow or the next day, something like that.
Thanks, Don. I guess there's one more question, Lisa.
Okay, my question, it goes back to the ADHD, autism, and how addiction plays into it. So addiction, as in, could you see that as something that is acquired, a deficit that is acquired, or I guess I'm not sure how to phrase the question, but how does addiction relate to ADHD and autism?
Yeah, good questions. So the way I see it is that addiction is a dysfunction of frontal cortical systems, frontal cortex. When there is a dysregulation of the control that the frontal cortex exerts on other systems, right? There's a dysregulation, a disinhibition, if you will. Part of what you get is impulsive behavior, right? Instead of control behavior, you remove that inhibition, you get impulsiveness. And so addiction is very similar in that it's a dysregulation of those systems that control other systems. And you get a dysregulation of the dopamine system, for example, and other reward networks that then kind of create a rush, if you will, to want to get the drug or whatever. Right. So I view dysregulation of frontal cortex as the common sort of thing between addiction, ADHD, and even autism.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
And Chelsea?
Hi there, Dr. Pineda. Lovely presentation.
Thank you.
You mentioned that prosocial behavior hadn't been demonstrated in labs with primates, but have there been any experiments that have demonstrated it amongst humans? Seems like it might be easier.
Well, I think what I said was that it's difficult to demonstrate it in the lab environment. So it's been shown, and there are studies that seem to suggest that it does happen. But it's much easier to demonstrate it in the wild, naturalistic environments. No, definitely in humans, there have been tons of, pro-social behavior studies. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions? If not, let's thank our speaker again for a really wonderful talk. It was very enlightening, very enjoyable.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.